I had hoped the closed down COVID-based interregnum would provide museums a rare opportunity to reconsider first principles. I hope that museums would further promote peaceable coexistence of irreconcilable difference in a more civil, equitable, and inclusive society. And I envision museums as useful centers for meeting real needs and desires. But alas, our inequities predate COVID, and the COVID shutdown period has not universally provided many impulses for new ways of doing things. And for me, too many museums have reopened without much change, save for COVID safety precautions. We have self-congratulated ourselves too much and re-examined too little. Yet there have always been small examples of brave leaders and glimpses of innovative progress. And I wanted us to look optimistically at some examples of these. So I put this panel together. I asked 4 very differently focused museum professionals to present a specific issue, an example of the institution that has taken action to move their issue forward. Understanding that none of the examples presented fully reconcile avenues of inquiry, but that each example gives us some glimpse of where we might be going. Each person on the panel has come from a geographically different place, has an international perspective, and can extrapolate from the individual example to the more general issues underpinning them. Each panelist picked the issue of their choice, chose the example, and will present their findings in their own style. 3 of the 4 will speak about projects in which they're involved, and 1 will speak from her perch as chair of the board of directors of the European Museum Forum, where she sees annual reviews of many innovative attempts to rectify our unsolved issues. I am thrilled to have these 4 people here. They each are folks who have spent their professional lives walking the walk of thoughtful change. They will each speak for 5 minutes. We have intentionally not looked at reductionist conclusions, nor do the issues stick together holistically, because we are presenting examples of next steps, not an omnibus conclusion. We will use these examples for a panel-wide discussion of these and other issues, and then we will include your questions and comments found on them as well. While I personally know and admire each of the panelists, I have asked them to introduce themselves in terms they wish to be most usefully known to you. And so they will speak for 5 minutes each in the following order, and they will follow one upon each other without my interrupting again. They are Jette Sandahl, Melanie Adams, Jack Mensah, and Margo Neale.
I'm Jette Sandahl. I've been the director of the Women's Museum of Denmark, of the Museum of World Cultures in Sweden, and most recently, the Museum of Copenhagen. I've also been part of the directorates of the National Museum of Denmark and of Te Papatongareva Museum of New Zealand. Elaine, you asked for concrete, specific, positive examples, and I've chosen to talk about initiatives that I've not personally been part of, but typical of these Corona times I've been able to follow online. I'm raising the case of 3 specific institutions and some of the important actions that support and drive restitution and repatriation. And as I do so, I should probably say that what I'm saying is my interpretation, not one that they have given me. I believe it's extremely important to keep the pressure on this core issue so that complacency does not set in again after another round of symbolic repatriations. And I find it interesting and significant how individual museum directors accept accountability and can take steps towards developing some sort of global justice or global ethics. In my example today, they are 3 female directors working outside of their own countries. Museum collections are obviously just the tips of the icebergs of colonial and imperialist dominance, but they're significant on both sides of the colonial divides as highly visible and tangible memories of a European or Western time of glory and dominance still clinging on for life in these dedicated institutions of museums. The issue of restitution and repatriation also serve as an entrance into exploring how basic concepts of justice and of rights are understood in museums. They serve as parables for how we as institutions perceive ownership and our relationship to communities, and for our fears of loss of privilege as academics and professionals. With the exhibition Resist, the Act of Resistance in 2021, the Rauschenschau's Joost Museum in Cologne, under the direction of Annette Snoep, placed the issue of restitution within a historic context and within a broader context of resistance, creating a platform for critical discussions, for practicing or learning resistance, for exploring solidarity and creating active networks. Presenting, for instance, Ghanaian filmmaker Neale Wu and streaming his landmark film from 1970, You Hide Me, on African artifacts held in the British Museum, the museum makes clear that the case for repatriation is not recent or new, but has been made beautifully, imaginatively, convincingly, and continuously. Seeing this film, one wonders whether it's the opposition to the quest for repatriation more than the quests themselves that need further examination and documentation. Also in 2021, the Piet Rivers Museum, under director Laura van Broekhoven, has continued the steep plunge into institutional self-reflection, openly, publicly, and transparently. This happens within traditional academic research, as in Dan Hicks' publication focused on the Benin bronzes, as well as in a series of projects and events where people with a primary relationship and claim to particular collections can encounter and interact with these in the museum to liberate the objects, so to speak, from the oppressive meta-language through which they've been collected, classified, documented, interpreted, and narrated. In these partnerships, the museum is systematically delegitimizing supremacist institutional history and exploring alternative epistemologies as framework for museum objects and caring for collections. In January 2021, the State Ethnographic Collections of Saxony, under director Leontine Meyer-Manvensch, hosted a dramatic high visibility poster campaign through the streets of Dresden by Nigerian artist Emeka Okbo, Missing in Benin. In December 2021, the same artist will be showcased in the Grassi Museum in Leipzig in the exhibition At the Threshold, posing pointed questions about the alienation objects suffer in the museum context, where, stripped of specific life stories, individual identity and autonomy, they are reduced to a state of imposed status. By bringing these questions into the public sphere, into the streets, the museum also implicates and involves the residents, the Saxony public. The issues of colonialism, of power and privilege implicate us all. There is no time or space for contrived innocence or ignorance in this context anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Melanie Adams, and I serve as the director of the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. We are located in Southeast DC and have been a museum since 1967. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of the museum's work during the pandemic, but also some work of my colleagues here at American-based museums and what they've done during the pandemic as well. So how do we begin to measure success when it is no longer based on the number of people walking through our doors? As museums continue to go deeper into community work, It is important to develop a shared understanding of success that centers the needs of the community. For some, success may be found in the messy process of co-creating, where others may judge success by the attraction of new audiences. Regardless of the metric used, museums should take this opportunity to look beyond attendance numbers and look for measurements that show how the museum is a vital community resource during difficult times and can help communities not only survive, but thrive. The three examples I provide are museums that took risks and stepped outside of their walls, and some would say missions, though I disagree. These museums realized that during a pandemic, they couldn't act like it was business as usual and push out content that ignored the reality of the pandemic. These museums responded by listening to the needs of the community and providing the resources to make it happen. The first example is the Baltimore Museum of Industry. They were one of the first cultural organizations to work with a healthcare provider to set up a vaccination site on their parking lot. The site was in a high-need area for the community, and the museum had the resources in terms of the outdoor space that made a vaccination clinic even possible. In addition to the clinic in the parking lot, the museum also installed an exhibit outdoors along their fencing, which allowed people to experience museum content in a COVID-safe manner. The second example is the Wisconsin Historical Society, who went a step further and instead of providing space, actually provided staff to the state to help fight the pandemic. Instead of researching collections, curators helped contextualize public health measures. The collections management staff used their skills to create a process to allocate supplies to area health clinics. The community engagement specialists assisted with how best to meet the vast testing needs in the diverse communities. Finally, the cultural cartographer turned his attention away from historic maps and focused on mapping COVID hotspots. The Wisconsin Historical Society staff successfully took their museum skills and used them to help find solutions to the many problems presented by the pandemic. The final example is from my own museum, the Anacostia Community Museum. Located in a low-income area in Washington, D.C., the neighborhood around the museum struggled with issues of food inequality even before the pandemic. Once the pandemic hit and students were home instead of being fed at school, the situation became worse. My museum decided to address the situation directly by working with a local nonprofit to place a refrigerator in our parking lot. This fridge is stocked with prepared meals each day that anyone can access without filling out forms or showing identification. Since its placement in January of 2021, more than 8,500 meals have been distributed. Similar to the Baltimore Museum of Industry, the Anacostia Community Museum went beyond our walls by placing an exhibit a few miles away in a predominantly African-American community. The exhibit, Men of Change, told the story of perseverance and resilience of more than 30 African-American men, from Bayard Rustin to August Wilson to Chance the Rapper. We also worked directly with the community to help them select their own men of change and write labels explaining why they received this honor. Because it was all outdoors and off-site, we do not have typical quantitative numbers, but we do have qualitative data that shows what the exhibit meant to the community. These examples have very little to do with traditional work of museums, but I believe show how we can use our resources to directly help our communities. The question remains is how we measure the impact these types of activities have on the community. While we hope to not experience another pandemic in our lifetime, there are many ways that museums can continue to serve their communities without an international crisis. I challenge museums to think about their mission and values and create opportunities that align with these often static documents. From there, how will you develop measurements that hold you accountable not only to yourself, but more importantly, to your community?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Zach Mensah, and I'm co-CEO of Birmingham Museums Trust in England. I've spent my career as a fixer making change happen with a simple guiding principle of how can I help. I joined the sector in 2013 because so much stuff looked broken. I've having done some work in other parts of the sector, so museums seemed the kind of perfect place for me to spend the next part of my career. Birmingham Museums Trust, where I get to co-lead with my brilliant job share partner, Sarah Rajiv, has about £1 billion worth of assets and sits within a city that is one of the youngest cities in the country with one of the most diverse audiences as well, which means, and I'll come on to this later on, it's the perfect testing ground for some of the change that we believe in the sector that we need to make. I was also really struck by the book Culture is Bad for You by Brooke, O'Brien and Taylor, which talks about the creation and consumption of creative industries. And actually, perhaps we all in this room, whether physically or digitally, although we could be part of the solution, we're also currently actually a large part of the problem. And we all talk about wanting to make change. And as Elaine said at the beginning, have yet to do so at any particular scale. So one of the catalysts as well for this change I'm about to talk about is that personal COVID reassessment, like many of us. I had severe COVID anxiety. I wanted to think much more about how I could make a dent in the world with the work that I was doing, rather than just being part of the problem. And around the same time as the tragic murder of George Floyd, and then a sudden spotlight on anti-racism within the sector, just after May, this role was advertised to be CEO, and Sarah contacted me via Twitter. And we had a brief conversation and talked about how, in both our careers, having met through Museum Detox, which is a people of colour-led network, how we wanted to lead with the change we wanted to be. And so that's how our job share and co-CEO came around as an option, which is one of the things we wanted to do, was to show that it is possible to make change at all levels, because it often was talked about being a CEO was a one-person job. And there are lots of reasons why actually working in different ways is really important. I was particularly struck by the Netflix show Explained, called the episode called "Why Women Are Paid Less," which I'll put in the chat. It's a YouTube video which you can see, and that led to a further complication that during the pandemic, of course, not only we're in a pandemic, there was lots of interest on anti-racism. There's also the climate emergency, but one of the issues we were all having is that there's this massive spate of neophobia, which is the fear of new things. And that really led to us all having to make a choice, a sort of fork in the road. That, you can change yourself and you change the world, or you could try and hunker down and hope that this blew over. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sure that the pandemic, anti-racism, climate change, amongst many other things, are not just going to disappear and be gone tomorrow. And it's really important that we, if we do believe we truly are part of communities, actually then work towards them. There were also the forced experiments, of course, around the future of work, things as remote working and people-powered organisations that we all had the opportunity to be part of, and now felt like moving from forced experiments to making these choices was an active choice that we wanted to make. And also our chair was, when it was looking for our role as a CEO, was really clear that they wanted lots of radical change, and that was described in the job paperwork, which is they're looking for someone almost like a lab rat, so it's what's called a neophile. So, like, if you imagine me as a little lab rat, this idea of like looking at lots of changes, not because we wanted to do them because we are the bosses, but because that's the only way. If you revisit the idea of the premise of culture is bad for you, the structural problems are around class, gender, and race. And so we wanted to look at the four main areas of the organisation. So strategic direction, for example, wanted to get all about mass participation and reclaiming our collections. We wanted to look at our structures. So we want to move to a team of teams approach. And this idea of sharing consent through what we're looking at women, this idea of sociocracy, around working with people, marginalised people, all sorts of different people, in a way that's actually embedded into the structures of the organisation, rather than doing the typical outreach. We also wanted to rebuild all of our core processes. So things like holidays allow people who have family on far-flung parts of the world to actually have enough time to enjoy their trips. remote working, no meetings at lunchtime, focus on the fact that people do have our parents and how that impacts us, and also looking at our skills base. The consequence, hopefully, that Birmingham people making change the world is something everyone can see. And I'd just like to hand over to the next speaker.
I'd like to acknowledge the people of the land here and those who came before, which is what we always, a protocol we do in Australia. And clearly it's First Peoples, Indigenous peoples. I'd like to thank Elaine and the panel and very much the organisers of this conference. It's quite remarkable. On my business card, it says I'm head of the Centre for Indigenous Knowledges and Senior Indigenous Curator and Advisor to the Director. So it's a bit of a mouthful. But what isn't on my business card is I'm of Aboriginal and Irish descent, Aboriginal on my mother's side from the Kulin Gumbanga nations. But I, in both accounts, of course, I'm a fringe dweller of the British Empire in both accounts, really. So I'm a little irreverent in many ways. I'm in the UK because of the Songlines exhibition that some of you may have come across or heard something of, and all the images that are running behind me are sort of bits of it so that you get a sense of what I'm talking about because, you know, pictures tell a million words. Now, my three key points about the museum changing to meet a different future is probably where consumers become curators, where community drives a museum, where in the Indigenous space at least there's nothing about us without us, and it's also where you go to places that you haven't gone before without a roadmap, no certainty, and with every chance you'll be turned back on the road, which is very much the story of this exhibition, Songlines. I call it more an experience rather than an exhibition. Now, when Mary Beard, presenter of the BBC television program Inside Culture, asked me why Songlines would be relevant to the British audience, and I know that around here people don't know heaps about Australian Aboriginal people, I said, look, Mary, I couldn't think of anything more relevant right here and right now. It's the Empire striking back. You mob came to our continent 250 years ago and tried to colonise and civilise us. Well, it didn't work. We're still here, we're still there, and now we're coming here to show you how to be civilised sustainably. So Aboriginal people have managed the environment in concert with nature for some 60,000 plus years. But in 100 or 200 years, the Westerners have near destroyed it. So in our worldview, nature is not our collateral, we are hers. Now, in the light of the shadow, if you like, of the COP at Glasgow up the road, little heed was paid to what was right under their noses. So where the leaders of the wealthiest nations spun their climate inaction into a web of words. And as I said, the First Peoples of each nation's right this disruption have behaviours and values and practices that obviously time to return to. So this exhibition, though not set out to address anything but to reveal the culture of the people whose stories are being told because they are telling them, all of these factors, this relevance of today to today is apparent. Our expression is when you look behind, you see the future in your footprints. So when you look behind, you'll learn from the ancient wisdom of its first peoples, values and practices, and learn how to live respectfully with this planet. So the content, in fact, determines the method and media of this exhibition. So it resonates enormously with this environmental degradation, climate control, and all the other critical issues of the day. Therefore, the exhibition is not an art exhibition, it's not a science exhibition, it's not a history exhibition, it is in fact all of these. It's both an Australian Aboriginal story and a story of humankind. It offers us connectivity to each other and our planet in a fragmenting world. So what are songlines? Just briefly, they're a knowledge system. You can visualise them as pathways or corridors of knowledge that crisscross the continent, not only of Australia, but in fact under the layers of the so-called civilisation. They exist in all countries in the world. And this particular story, the Seven Sisters, in fact, does occur in all countries of the world. So the songlines, they connect you to country. Your mother, the country becomes mother. It's a person. Earth's a person. You worry for it, sing for it, cry for her. So the last thing you do is rape your mother, which is kind of what's happening because people don't have that respectful relationship with country. And it's where your identity resides. Now, the seeds of the role of a future museum lies, in fact, in the genesis of this exhibition, Songlines. It's not 5 minutes yet, is it? Oh, no one's timekeeping. That's a shame. Well, I have to move a bit fast, I think. In 2010, Anangu elders from the Centre for Australia came to the museum and said, our songlines are all broken up and we want you to help put them back together again. It was an urgent plea that this whole story of relationship to country was being lost. Fancy going to museums. Museums were historically the ones who stole human remains and desecrated sacred sites, but this is the historic irony of when, you know, the need matches museums need to serve as well. So we had ended up with a journey exhibition where the visitors become a participant. 3 deserts were mapped across the floor of the gallery. The paintings become portals to place. Virtual elders were throughout the exhibition. So this is, some might call it decolonising, I call it revocalising or revoicing the museum. And it's authentic. It has that authentic thing. So we no longer have people speaking for us. So it's striking back at the museum in the same way as it's striking back at history as a coloniser, but in the Western institutions are, of course, colonial projects in themselves. So the power roles are reversed. Consumers become the creators. We set up a curatorium, which means if these communities are curators, it's a curatorium who works in a co-authored position with the curators of the museum. We're both set knowledge holders. We both share the knowledge, and from our different ones got the stories and the content, the others got the know-how for the audiences and the visitors. The governance structure that you'll see here, sometimes the central hub is not the council of the museum, but Jukapa, the law of the Aboriginal people whose stories are being told. And it's a very embodied knowledge system. The communities work with the museums, not the museums working with communities. That means we don't just go and consult on ideas, as is the more traditional way of doing it. And prompted by Elaine Gurian's point about the need for new behaviours inside our institutions to model society outside our walls towards a negotiated coexistence, I see the model of this exhibition, which is more than an exhibition, it's been called a communication portal, it's been called a whole range of things. It's a heritage preservation project, which it was born out of. The exhibition is not really the right word anymore. So I see the model of the Songlines experience inverts this to outside communities remodelling the inside of the museum. So we're boundary riders who work across art galleries, museums, not any one confined space. Thank you.
If everyone will unmute, I will ask you all to respond in ways that allow us at least to talk across the boundary. But let me begin by saying to all the audience that one of my big takeaways in this presentation is how many issues we have, how equally important they are, and how they don't necessarily cohere. That we all have many things to do all at the same time. And since we can't do many things all at the same time, everything, the notion of choice, which was what I asked our panelists to do, to pick what was top of their mind, both in their experience, in their time commitment, but also in their sense of what was most important to them, makes you understand that we have a very big landscape on which we are working all at the same time. On the other hand, when you listen to what Zach said and what Margo said and what Jette said and what Melanie said, they do cohere, but they cohere only in the sense that we are all working at trying to rectify the history of our origins and trying to become a much more, I would say, just organization and sector. But now let me turn it over to my colleagues who feel free to respond to each other. And those of you listening, if you will start to write your questions. We have somebody listening to that on your portal, and we'll start to put them in, and we will try and include them as well. My colleagues, over to you.
Sure. I'm happy to start. I really liked what Zach said in terms of taking that this opportunity to look internally. And I think, Elaine, that fits exactly what you said during your opening in terms of if museums aren't using this time to really take a look inward and look at their processes, procedures, the work that they're doing, and how will they come out of this pandemic kind of new and changed, then we're really doing the disservice to our communities. And I think what Zach said about so many people, and I'd say we were included sometimes in that, we're so just anxious about pushing out content, but did we really step back and figure out, is that what was needed at that time? And how could we best serve our community by looking inward so we were stronger when we did reopen later?
And just to pick up a little bit further on that point, one of the things we also realized quite quickly was about this idea of recruitment. And I know it came up in a previous session, particularly around class, that lots of what we do isn't on purpose, but actually it's really damaging. So when we have these really difficult recruitment procedures, for example, it's no wonder you end up with more of the same. And not to say that people in the sector aren't great people, but to say that actually no wonder you don't get anything different, because you're doing the same things and expecting a different outcome.
I personally think HR is one of the central organizations and central rethinking positions of equity in our future. And that the looking inward, but looking inward quite specifically about the theories of work, the understanding of work in a common sense, that what Margo talked about, which are different knowledge bases. Well, different knowledge systems have different understandings of work. And one of the things we have never really looked at is a wholesale relook at multicultural understanding of work itself and what equity in work itself means in terms of the family and in community cohesion. So it's a very big deal for me. I also think that Margo and Jette, speaking at the polar ends of new introduction of ways of installing exhibitions with multivocality and giving back or somehow relitigating our collections all have the same, or are parts of each other's continuum. And I wonder, Jette, how you reacted having been in Tapapa and having done your presentation about collections and repatriation, react to Margo's presentation coming directly from the Aboriginal people themselves.
I think one thread that goes through all these four presentations is one of a change in permeability, I guess you say in English, the permeability of the borders around the museum as an institution. I think that's what we're all talking about, that things or people can pass in and out of these boundaries or these borders in ways that were unthinkable 10, 20 years ago. So that permeability, I think, is where new things are really happening now. And then they can have different themes or different methods. But I think the permeability and this sort of outside-in relationship is a profound new trend.
I totally agree. And I wonder, Margo, what you thought, even though you were standing there instead of being on Zoom, what you thought of all your colleagues bringing to the table these, what Jette is talking about, permeability or new definitions.
I was just struck by the diversity of what each were talking about, but certainly permeability and mobility and change of purpose and angle and direction was obvious in all of the papers, particularly like the vaccination, the use of car parks. This is sort of a museum without walls idea is of particular interest to me. And in various ways, each of them spoke to that. You've disappeared, Elaine.
I'm still here. One of the things that, because I know Melanie, one of the things she struggles with, which is in some ways the other side of permeability, is the desire on some portion of not only her staff, but her visitors to recapture classic museumness. That credibility lives in the classic form, and that these experimentations that we're talking about are the very opposite of the classic sense of how they wish to present themselves. So in this community, which is grateful for now the refrigerator in their parking lot, which they make use of, they put pressure on Melanie in quite the opposite direction. So Melanie, I hope you would talk about that.
Sure. And I think where that comes in is where I talk about success. We don't have a new measure for success. And I think that's where, as we're looking at the community, how do I measure the success of that refrigerator? Like, at least now I have numbers. So I know 8,500 people have gotten meals, but it goes beyond those 8,500 people. And how are we now perceived in the community? So how do we have those models of being able to talk about the work we're doing in the community and the impact that we're having beyond someone walking through our door to see an exhibit, I think is really important. And I think another way we can look at that is something I really liked as Margo was talking, was really thinking about the interdisciplinary nature of our work. I almost feel like early on with museums, it was you were history, you were art, you were science. And now we've recognized that humans do not categorize themselves in those nice little neat boxes. And there's this interdisciplinary nature among all of our work, regardless of how your museum classifies itself. And I think that's one of the things I really love about being at ACM is we are art, history, science. We are everything rolled up into one. And how do we talk about how all of those interdisciplinary natures create that community base that we're looking for?
Let me call on Zach, because one of the things I'm thinking about, at least in the political agenda of worldwide politics, is that progressives think about new and adventurous ways to solve the problem, but the pushback in a certain way surprises us. But the preservation of the classic museum form has its soul in both the colonialist aspect and in people who never got their voices heard before, who wish to show up in that form which has a status equivalent. So I wonder, Zach, is there pushback from your institution turning from something that looked quite classic before, and what are you doing with that pushback?
I think there's a little bit, because that's natural, isn't it? So, like, typically when the rubber meets the road is where people start to have some concern. So Sarah and I have been in post now for almost a year, and everyone's up for radical transformation, but I've done transformation before in the past, and everyone says they're up for it until it impacts them directly. So whether that be our workforce or be a partner. And so what we're trying to do is be really clear about where we're headed, so people have that option if they wanted to get off the bus, as it were, they can choose to do that. And so there has been a little bit of resistance, but I would say that people are already up for that change, because lots of the change is positive. You mentioned a little bit earlier about well-being. One of the questions, sorry, was around well-being and around our workforce. And there's been too little focus on well-being. So actually quite a lot of the work that we're doing is actually in service of making this place a better place to work for people, but also acknowledging burnout and the fact that all change is scary for people, and we have to acknowledge that and do it in a respectful way. So I'd say that it's been positive to date, but if you wanted to speak to 150 plus staff, which everyone's welcome to do, you might hear some people saying, this is really cool, and other people saying, whoa, 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 this is happening too fast. So I would say, in all honesty, it's the usual mixture of feelings as you go from kind of what you are now to the future. There's a point where you have to just leap, and we're at that point where we stood at the edge, we run back, and now we're running towards that end, and we're about to jump.
Jette, you lived in a world which was great pushback of the changing world, the progressive new world, and there was pushback in almost all your posts. I'm deeply concerned on something I call centering, which is trying to figure out how we are going to make peace with the acknowledged pushback and the unacknowledged pushback. That tradition of our institutions has supporters not from the usual retrograde side only, but supporters because the meaning of our institutions and the form of our institution has power for people whose voice has not been heard before. And I wonder in things like the definition where this kind of middle ground or porosity is going to land from your point of view.
I don't think that I see this in the same terms as you do.
Right.
In the many different places I've worked and doing what people say, extremely radical things inside the museum, in my experience, the pushback is from within the professional community, not from outside the community. I have never had, even, doing really contentious, big exhibitions around, for instance, migration, asylum seekers in places like the National Museum of Denmark. There's never been a conservative argument outside the museum. I feel that polarization is much more within our own community. And I feel that that's where our difficulties lie in the next period. And when you mentioned the museum definition, that was clearly the case there also. So I'm not sure that what I'm so much searching for is middle ground. When I bring the example up of the film from 1970, You Hide Me, it's because I would like our community to remember all these great things that have been done, that have happened, and on which amnesia has settled. And I think that amnesia is actually part of the opposing forces. So I think I'm much more interested in us beginning to make quite precise analysis of what is carrying our new positive developments and what are these opposing forces, and to be very precise in our analysis of what that is and what that pushback is.
Before we move on, does somebody else on the panel wish to talk about pushback and incorporation or rejection of pushback? Pushback is inevitable. I find it in the political arena of America both terrifying and surprising that the pushback has entered the arenas of avenues we'd never even considered in our country before. And I'm trying to struggle with how adventure in the more equitable space has caused irrational but quite dangerous pushback. So before I leave that and go on to more questions, and the questions are about different knowledge systems and different knowledge systems at the same time, how do we protect our staff and our ongoing responsibilities? So in some ways they're the same. Do any of you have any strategies about this pushback in ways that will incorporate them rather than both naming them but also welcoming them, so that we are really not tearing our entire system, both museum system and personal political systems, apart? I wonder whether museums have any responsibility in that arms around healing wherever the pushback and the adventurous going forward is. And if you would raise your hand, I would know who to call on in this regard. Otherwise, I'm going to pick someone. Zach.
I guess I'd just like to acknowledge, as you mentioned, it's understanding what games we're playing. So, for example, to understand what it is about politics, right, that gets people excited or peed off, whatever, is it's part of the game. So for me, what we're trying to do is steer through this by understanding sort of the big politics side of things, as well as understanding on a more local level and internal level what those things are, maybe where the edges are. So you can kind of understand when you're pushing up against it. It's something that we're doing as a purposeful tactic to then make sure that we don't end up getting in the crosshairs for reasons that we could potentially avoid, is what I'd say about that. I was back in my old role in Bristol, there's an example of that when the Colston statue fell, for example, and fell into the harbour. And so that became suddenly, museums suddenly became political, and there was lots of thinking around how do you negotiate that without, ultimately, it sounds weird, but losing your job, because it's very easy when things like that happen for someone or an organisation to kind of step on a landmine.
The question, Margo, is an interesting one, but it really follows on for what we've been talking about. It's from a person who said they've read a book called Sand Talk, but what they are really asking about is how do you approach engagement with communities when you're approaching change and transformation? What do the communities you work with offer us in this dilemma of change and pushback and new ways of working?
I think they just shift into an entirely different arena. So I don't feel any pushback or anything in my work, except perhaps Mrs. Jette, who said, if anything, it'll be in Australia, the Indigenous Aboriginal stuff is there's a big hunger for things Indigenous in our country now, particularly in galleries and museums and in the performance and arts and sport. It's almost seen as privilege, which sort of builds up a bit of rivalry and jealousy from other sectors. And the only exhibitions we tour that have any that are requested in the Indigenous space, just as this Songlines one, which will go to Paris and Germany and elsewhere. In terms of other knowledge systems, I think what the museum has had to learn from, say, the communities I work with, and these remote Aboriginal people from remote regions, where they're different from people like me from urban regions and a whole range in between, is that you sort of got to go with the flow. You can't necessarily stick to schedules and timelines. Things happen as they happen, and you've got to talk around and around, heaps of conversations, all those projects, all the project schedules and things can, disappear overnight. And you have to build in that it's an organic process, and that in this case, many times it took over 10 years, because what is different than perhaps other projects is this was all done on the ground. You saw in the images 6,000-7,000 kilometres travelling country to get to record material, which is not normally how things are done or take that long. It's supposed to take 5 years and half the money. So as many times it didn't happen. It wasn't going to happen. It did happen. So it's now got its own reward. So the point, it has changed the processes and thinking within the museum on these sorts of things. But the changes I'd like to see is more of the organisational or corporate chart and how that looks, which we'll get to next.
We have 5 minutes to go. Let me go back and restate a point I made in the beginning. I feel very privileged to be on a panel with all of you who are, in fact, practitioners walking the walk, as I pointed out. And yet you do it all in very different styles, some of it related to your culture, some of it related to your personality, some to your circumstance. If there's a takeaway for me, it is the more we learn from each other, the wider our palette. And the more we understand that stylistically, we each have a different road to do that, and that they are, as one of the exhibits I long ago did called All Roads Are Good. There is immense learning to be had from having listened to this panel, not only in the issues themselves, which are in fact all central issues, but the methodology of presentations, the specificity of presentation, to use the word again, that is itself one of the cultural differences we all have to look at. And the permeability that Jette talked about may in fact include the way we work and the way we present ourselves and the issues we have with each other and the outcomes. It makes it much more complex that we have such a big calendar and that we don't need to all work the same way or have the same conclusions going in the same directions. But for me, it's part of the fascination to have looked at the dialectic that you all presented as well as the information. I'm very grateful that you are all here. There are 4 minutes, and I would allow each of you to have a closing word should you wish.
I'm happy to start. I just want to say quickly, I think my closing word, and this comes kind of as a little bit of an answer to the question in the chat, is how are you taking care of your staff? And I think one of the things I had a wonderful colleague, Lisa Sasaki, mention early on is you're not working from home, you're working from home during a pandemic. So as much as we want to push change, let's remember that, our first community really is our staff. And so how are we making sure that they're safe during this time as we do try to push to serve the communities outside of our doors?
Thank you. Jette?
I think the examples have been really interesting, and it's been really interesting to hear what other people have done. And for me, I think in many countries in Europe, the code word has been museums asking people to support them, where some of the great examples today have been the museums actually supporting people. And I think it's that reversal again that also Margo was talking about, and museums increasingly becoming part of the infrastructure of a city or region. So I find that transition great, interesting.
Zach?
As I said right at the beginning, is just asking people, how can you help? So, try every day to be able to help people, but also acknowledging that we are in a pandemic. So some days not achieving very much is very, very normal. I want to let everyone know that no matter how great this talk has been, all of us, I'm sure, in the last 18 months have had really difficult days, and we will have more difficult days in the future. So please don't all be too hard on yourselves.
And Margo?
They've said it all, really.
You have a minute.
Well, I've just endorsed everything everyone else said, and thank you very much for actually convening this difficult topic, because I do have to think a bit more about it more broadly and read your new book.
Thank you.
And you can read mine.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, everyone out there. This has been taped, and you'll get to see it. I hope you will take away that you are included in our thoughts, even though this technology didn't allow us to see you. You do see each other. And I hope we have sparked some way for you to begin to look at the enormity, but understand to tackle it on the human level, one step at a time. Thank you again.
Thank you.